In this recording, we'll discuss ear physiology. So we've discussed that our ears are responsible for helping with hearing and balance. Okay, so very quickly, the equilibrium and balance part, we have two types of equilibrium. We have static equilibrium, which is basically no motion of the head specifically, or dynamic equilibrium, where you do have head motions. Now, the information that we gather about our balance and equilibrium is carried to the brain via cranial nerve number 8, or vestibular cochlear nerve, and specifically it will be traveling down the vestibular branch of cranial nerve number 8. Now, we have two structures that work together to help us overall with the equilibrium and the balance. We've got the semicircular canals, which help with the direction of the movement. Okay, so the head is moving in left or right. How quickly is the head moving? We're moving in angular motions, things like that. We send all that information to the brain. So the semicircular canals basically help with maintain your balance. And then your vestibule. Okay, this sends signals about the position of your head with respect to gravity. Okay, now that's probably not something that you really think about on a regular basis. Where is my head with respect to gravity? But this helps us control our eye movements. Okay, so we can maintain our balance while we're moving and stuff. And just to remind you, you've got your cochlea, which is hearing, then you've got your vestibule and your semicircular canals, which do balance. Okay. Now, sound, hearing. Okay. Let's talk about sound itself. Sound travels in waves. Okay, and waves have both peaks and valleys. Sometimes they're referred to as crests and troughs. Okay. Sound waves can travel through the air, and if your auricle funnels them into your external auditory canal, then those would eventually be sounds that we could process. Those sound waves will move from the air. They'll have to go through the ossicles, the ear bones, okay, so bone conduction, and then they'll make their way into the inner ear where we can process that information. Now, we have two different ways that we can describe sounds: pitch, okay, and loudness. So pitch is described as, it's basically a frequency, okay? So how many peaks pass by in a certain time period. So how many peaks do you see in a minute? Something like that. It's measured in hertz, okay? And we're basically measuring wavelength, okay? We're measuring peak to peak, okay, or crest to crest. The more crests, more peaks you get in a different time, in a given time period, the higher the frequency or the higher the pitch. Okay. We also measure loudness, okay, which is the amplitude or the height of the wave. So that would be peak to valley instead. Nope, go back. This is measured in decibels. So we have hertz and decibels. This is basically, we can use these two terms to describe overall sounds, because you can mix and match these. You can have a high-pitched sound, but it's kind of a soft, low sound, but you could have a low-pitched sound that's very loud. Okay, so we can use both of these terms, we can use both of these measurements to describe the sounds that we are hearing. Okay, so the intensity of the sound is the loudness and the amplitude together. We actually amplify the sound waves that are coming into the auditory canal. We amplify those at the ossicles themselves. So I talked about mixing and matching. That's kind of what this would look like. Small amplitude would be a soft sound. Large amplitude would be a loud sound. Shorter wavelength is high-pitched. Longer wavelength is low-pitched. But then again, we can mix and match. Okay, so this is high-pitched, and it looks kind of loud as well because it has a high amplitude. Okay, but we could have high pitch but quieter sound if these waves weren't quite as tall. Okay, and vice versa. We could have a really loud sound, okay, so a high amplitude, but it's a very low pitch, low sound. Okay. All right, so we have kind of mentioned the pathway of sound in bits and pieces, but we are going to put it all together. Now, there are a lot of steps. There are 6 steps-ish, okay? Lots of structures that we're going to go through. If at any time you're like, oh, I don't remember what that structure is, don't be afraid. Go back, listen to the previous lecture. All right, so here we go. Again, if anything's like, oh, I don't remember, don't hesitate. Go back, rewatch the anatomy video, make sure you know what's going on. Okay, so we're going to take the sound waves from the external environment. The auricle is going to funnel them down the external auditory meatus, or your auditory canal. We're going to hit that tympanic membrane. Now that tympanic membrane is going to vibrate, and that's going to cause the auditory ossicles to also vibrate and move. Remember, the auditory ossicles in order are malleus, incus, and stapes. Okay. As the sound waves move through those bones, the sound is also being amplified, so it's now louder than it previously was. The stapes will send the sound waves to the next stop via the oval window. Okay. We are going to basically turn those sound waves into pressure waves. Okay, so pressure waves in the perilymph, in the vestibule, okay, specifically your vestibular duct. Okay, and if we keep going, okay, we've now made it to the inner ear, basically. So those pressure waves distort your basilar membrane. Okay, the basilar membrane is going to vibrate. Okay, this vibration causes the hair cells at your spiral organ to also move. Remember, now the spiral organ is located within the cochlea, and don't forget that the cochlea is your hearing organ. Okay, so we've finally made it to the cochlea. Now, the hair cell movements cause neurotransmitters to be released, okay, which stimulates your sensory neurons. We're going to create action potentials here from this neurotransmitter release. The more hair cells that are stimulated, the more neurotransmitters that are released, the louder and more intense the sound is interpreted as. Okay? Now, these sensory neurons will all basically fuse, I guess, to form your cochlear branch of cranial nerve number 8. Okay? That sends information to the pons and medulla for distribution by your thalamus. Okay, so we're basically moving through the pons and the medulla. We're going to go up to the thalamus. Remember, your thalamus is your relay station. So your thalamus says, oh, these are sound signals. And so your thalamus is like, oh, these need to go to the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. So finally, we make it to the temporal lobe and we can process that information. Okay. Basic pathway, tympanic membrane, auditory ossicles into the perilymph. Okay, and this doesn't really show the hair cells or the cranial nerves or anything like that, but this is the basic pathway. And just a different view. Okay, you can see your cochlear branch of your cochlear nerve. We're going to go up through the medulla and the pons. We hit the thalamus. Your thalamus is like, oh, these are sound signals. Sound needs to go to the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe for processing. Okay, and you can read all these little things. Okay. All right, so sometimes things go wrong, so we can have conditions. You could suffer from conduction hearing loss. Okay, so this could be a problem with your outer ear or your middle ear. Okay. Any of those scenarios prevent sound from reaching your inner ear. Okay, and remember, your inner ear is where we created the action potentials to send signals to your brain. This can include things like buildup of earwax, middle ear infections, a busted eardrum, or fusion of your auditory ossicles. Okay. Now, here's the interesting part. Vibrations can reach the fluid of the inner ear through your temporal bone. okay, or bone conduction. So you could still hear sounds. It just goes through your temporal bone specifically. So, for example, if you put your hands over your ears, okay, or if you've got earmuffs on or something like that, or even like earplugs in, it's very likely that you can still hear something, okay, but it's much less accurate, so you might not be able to understand exactly what somebody is saying to you, okay, but those sound waves are still going directly through the temporal bone, so you can hear some sort of sound. Now, if you suffer from sensorineural deafness, okay, that means cranial nerve number 8 has been damaged. Okay, that means you are just deaf, right? You just can't hear anything at all because your cranial nerve has been damaged. The only way to really alleviate this is a cochlear implant. Okay, so you just kind of bypass and send the signals through this implant instead. Okay. And then finally, tinnitus is just a really common condition. Ringing in the ears, hissing, any kind of those little weird sounds. We think it's kind of probably due to exposure to repetitive loud noises, and it can be linked to deafness over time. Okay, so the loud noises can damage parts of your ear, like your cranial nerves and stuff like that as well.